Well, it's a beautiful morning. I've just crossed the sea from Athens to Heraklion in Crete. You can see the snow-peaked mountains in the distance. And as far as the ancient Greeks were concerned, Crete was always a place apart, older than the rest of the mainland, with different customs, different religion, different people. But I'm not the first person to make this voyage. If you were to come here in the late Bronze Age, this was a centre of the world. And in myth, one of the most legendary heroes of all, Theseus, made his way here. The reason why? Well, there was a particularly powerful king in this land, Minos, who'd imposed himself on the Athenians, forcing them to send a tribute every so often to be sacrificed to his son, the monstrous Minotaur. Somewhere out there in those mountains is the Labyrinth of the Minotaur. So, let's go have a look. Is this entirely a myth, or is there some truth to the tale? So, I have arrived at Knossos. Absolutely incredible place. Just the central palatial building alone is 3 acres wide. That's bigger than most entire archaeological sites from the previous era. Absolutely bonkers. We're talking thousands upon thousands of people, and a significant break from the Neolithic era which came before. Wow. Incredible place, right? Well, Arthur Evans thought so too. And he was the guy who came here in 1900 to dig the place. There had been a small-scale excavation before that by a Greek chap in 1876, round about the same time as Heinrich Schliemann worked at Troy and Mycenae. But there wasn't much that was known about the place. There was a small amount of excavations. Arthur Evans comes along. He's kind of like a landed gentry guy from Middle England. His father was a very rich landholder, and they were both fascinated by archaeology. So they came here to Knossos, where the locals had been talking about incredible things lying in the ground for decades. And we're still on the site here, just outside the official, entrance to the place. But as you can see, the ground is just littered with bits of pottery. Now, I mean, most of these might be, from the Ottoman era, but some of them are going to be Roman, some of them are going to be classical, and some could even be Minoan. Because that is the culture that built this place. One of the most extraordinary cultures in the entire history of the world. And a completely unique one. They're not like anywhere else. They're very different to the Mycenaean Greeks of the mainland, who in fact were massively inspired by the Minoans. They're very different to the later classical Greeks. And they're completely different to the Romans. Nothing like the Romans. The Romans were about power, about domination. The Minoans were obsessed with nature. They liked the finer things in life. Music, dance, celebration. And it was a very female-oriented society as well, which is interesting. That doesn't always happen. Really doesn't always happen. You have these incredible frescoes where it's all women that are in those frescoes, So Arthur Evans comes here in 1900. At that time, prehistoric archaeology, in many ways, was a blank slate. Very little was known about the Aegean, for example. Now synonymous with the term prehistoric archaeology. But at the time, very little was known. And when Arthur Evans came here, he didn't have many expectations of what he was going to find. You know, of course he was a dreamer. He wanted to find things, but he had no idea what he was going to find. Knossos, immediately when he started digging, completely blew away his wildest dreams. The place is of an immense size. It's absolutely huge. In terms of storage facilities, it's got the most in the entirety of ancient Greece, classical world included. What it said to him, being from a colonial British mindset, was that the place was a palace centre, a palatial centre. Now, today, experts aren't so sure. Could be any number of things, could be a religious centre, but a lot of people lived here and a lot was going on. Some of the most incredible things that Arthur Evans found at Knossos were two completely unique writing systems that had never been seen anywhere else before. He named them Linear A and Linear B to distinguish them from the many pictorial scripts that were also found at the site. Hieroglyphs, which kind of look a bit like ancient Egypt. So there was a lot of experimentation going on here. There was a lot of people trying to note down what was going on in their lives, record things for posterity, for record-keeping purposes, for economic purposes, tribute coming in maybe. And they did so, they recorded it. One of those writing systems, Linear B, turned out to be an early form of Greek. Took many decades to work that out though. It wasn't until the 1940s and 1950s that John Chadwick, Michael Ventris managed to finally crack the code of Linear B, and it turned out it was the Mycenaean Greek language. They came into Knossos later on, using it as an administrative centre of their own. But the other writing system, Linear A, is older. It seems to be the Minoan writing system. Probably it inspired Linear B. And unfortunately, Linear A has never been deciphered, only adding to the allure and the mystery of the Minoan civilization. But of course, they weren't called Minoans until Arthur Evans arrived here. They weren't called anything. You know, people didn't really know of their existence. But always having a flair for a good story and well aware of the archaeology of the place, relating it to the Labyrinth of King Minos. What did Arthur Evans call them? He called them the Minoans, after Minos himself. The things that they found on those first digs just boggle the mind. Bull-leaping frescoes, many references to bulls in fact, which is interesting considering the Minotaur is a half-man, half-bull figure. They found frescoes all over the place, in situ, still on the walls. Unfortunately, being a Victorian after all, and this was 124 years ago, Arthur Evans couldn't help himself. He had to reconstruct some of the buildings, some of the columns, some of the frescoes as he went. And he hadn't been alive in 1600 BC, 1700 BC, 1900 BC when this place was in its prime. So what does he do? He uses his imagination. He recreates them as best he can. So they're not particularly accurate, unfortunately. Many of the things you see today now are really frowned upon by archaeologists, really looked down on. I mean, there is an argument that it creates a really special visit when you come to a place like this, because most archaeological sites, if you go to most Minoan sites even, if you go to Malia or Phaistos or Moklos or Paleocastro, the other palatial centres, so-called palatial centres, you don't see any full buildings, you don't see any reconstructed things like you do here. So in a way, it's an interesting visit because of that. I mean, that's now archaeology in itself. But it isn't particularly accurate. The place may have looked pretty different to how he reconstructed it. We do know it was incredibly colourful. The walls were covered in reds and later on in blues and yellows and whites, making it a very, very colourful, beautiful, beautiful place. So I should probably tell you a little bit of the chronology of the place. The dates that we have now, 124 years after Evans's day, are pretty precise, telling us a huge amount about the place. Things that he couldn't have marvelled of, you know, back in the day. So 2000 BC, Crete is not really at the forefront of anything. It's been kind of a backward place for a long time. The Neolithic period comes along, then there's an early Bronze Age period. Not a huge amount's going on in Crete. You have some interesting sites and some great metalwork and things like this at Moklos and Gornia, but it's kind of dwarfed by what's going on in the Cycladic Islands with the early Cycladic civilization. But around about 2000 BC, thereabouts, just after, there is an astonishing change. Crete becomes the forefront of Aegean civilization. What we have is suddenly out of nowhere, boom, as so often does happen in history, there's a big bang, there's an old palatial system that begins. Places like Knossos, Malia, Phaistos become these incredible centres of commerce, of industry, of metalworking, of trade and religious veneration. People are attracted to these places. They come in and there's a kind of, we don't know if there's a royal family, anything like that. It could be a republic for all we know. We don't really know. But there's something going on. There's some sort of administrative system that rules life here. And the Cretans become very outward looking. They become international people. They are trading with Egypt, first and foremost, Anatolia to the north, mainland Greece, the Cycladic Islands, places like Byblos and Sidon in what is now Lebanon and Israel and Syria. All these places which during the Middle Bronze Age were great powers. Crete joins the club. So there is an old palace period where things are happening. Life is pretty good. These places are giant. They're like nothing anyone has ever seen before. They must have had some sort of central planning, an architect, team of architects. There's engineering, there's drainage systems in these places. There's very, very complicated things going on. But then the old palace period comes to an end. And what do we have then? The new palace period. So the old palace period may have been destroyed by earthquakes, we're not quite sure. But the new palace is where things really go wild. So this is kind of the Middle Bronze Age, 1600 BC. And Crete becomes, quite frankly, the greatest power that the Mediterranean Sea has ever seen. It's ridiculous. They take over, or at least export their culture to the Cyclades. Places like Akrotiri on Thera and Philokopi on Milos are very Minoan in their outlook, and they look Minoan. You know, there's Minoan items. Everybody wants Minoan items at this time. The Greek mainland too is obsessed with the Minoan world. Places as far afield as Messenia, Laconia, Boeotia, the Argolid, Attica, they all become obsessed with Crete. They want Cretan ceramics. And they start imitating Cretan styles, you know? So it's not just the Cretans moving to these places are massively inspired by what's going on here. And this could well be the period where the Greek myths start to form, the ones that are recorded as much as 1,000 years later. At this time, they're being told, they're being formed. And the power of Knossos is the kind of thing that gives you a King Minos in a myth. Theseus, the son of the king of Athens, comes here to do battle with the Minotaur. Now, interestingly, in recent years, what has been found at this place is that, like all Minoan sites, like all Minoan palatial centres anyway, so-called palatial centres, there's a large courtyard area in the middle. This was very likely to do with religious ceremonies, festivals, things like this, displays. Now, what may have happened is the bull leaping that we see in frescoes, that may have been happening at these ceremonies. And what we have is images of youths leaping over these bulls. So who's to say a real Theseus didn't come here from Athens to partake in the games as some kind of tribute, you know, or remembered as such anyway. So maybe Theseus did come here. Unfortunately, like all myth, we'll never know. We'll never know for sure. But that's what makes it interesting, isn't it? Something I noticed when I was walking around the site was that if you stand at the highest point, you can see the sea in the distance. In fact, the road that I took to come here in a taxi may well have been a Minoan road. There is evidence of a so-called royal road, Evans calls it that, going all the way from Heraklion, where the port is, where my boat came in, up to here. And it was these links to the sea that the Minoans were so obsessed with. You know, you see octopi and things like this, dolphins all over their artwork. They were obsessed with the sea. Of course they were. They were seafaring people. The sea had made them rich. The sea had made them powerful. But ultimately, the sea would be their end. In the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, the island of Thera exploded in a vast catastrophe of destruction. The biggest volcanic eruption in the last 10,000 years. It was ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. The biggest in the Holocene, I believe. At Crete, the city on Thera was absolutely annihilated. But here on Crete, it was different. There was a slow, lingering end. Tidal waves came across, wrecking everything down by the sea and probably destroying their fleets. Unfortunately, someone whose fleets weren't destroyed, protected by bays as they were by the intricacies of geography, were the Mycenaean Greeks on the mainland. So, in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, what happens is, suddenly, Linear B shows up here. Many of the other palatial centres are destroyed forever, never to be rebuilt. But here, there's a takeover. The Mycenaeans suddenly arrive, and from then on, about 1450 BC, something like that, after a period of destruction in the archaeological record, cannibalism and horrible things like this going on, this is a Mycenaean island. So things probably survived from before, but ultimately the rulers had changed. Still not many fortifications anywhere, which is interesting, but that's probably because of the sea power of the place. But the Minoan civilization had come to an end, leaving us with these incredible marvels and myths that we can still enjoy today. Well, I'm going to go have some lunch in the marvellous local cafe just by the site, and I'll probably buy some lovely souvenirs. Might buy some artefacts, replicas of course. So if you like this video, like and subscribe, do all that stuff, and let me know if you like this sort of thing. I can do these ones fairly easily. It's, you know, I'm just ad-libbing. So yeah, that's about it from me, folks. I'll see you on the next one.